Our guest, Mark Mix of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. He is their president. Good morning.
Good morning, Pedro.
For those who don't know, how would you define right to work laws?
Right to work is very simple. We believe that every worker should have the right to join a union, and that right should be protected, and it is under federal law. But we also believe that no worker should be compelled as a condition of employment to pay dues or fees to a union to get or keep a job.
Why not?
Because we just don't think it's fair. You know, individuals have choices, and we believe that compulsion is wrong in almost every instance. The only instance where we give compulsion, we give it to government. They are a monopolistic force. But yet labor unions in this country since 1935 have enjoyed the privilege of being able to tell someone you must, well, at first they said you must be a member of an organization, which is kind of a real stretch, and I think the Supreme Court agreed with that back in the early 1960s. They said, you know, we can't make you a formal member of a union, of a private organization. Well, we can make you pay up to 100% of dues or fees for the privilege of working in America. And so the right to work laws are very simple. They protect a worker's right to join a union, but they also say you can't be fired if you simply fail to tender dues or fees.
Our previous guest said that when it comes to those type of laws, it gives people who don't want to pay the fees the same protections as those in the union as far as their employment and things along that nature.
Yeah, Pedro, that's an interesting question about labor law, and it goes to the heart of what the bargaining process is about. Union officials have the privilege to impose themselves on every single person in a bargaining unit through the means of exclusive monopoly representation. That means that once a union is certified in the workplace, that no worker can talk directly to the employer can't deal with an individual employee on an individual basis, that everyone has to be in this collective. And so union officials use this power of exclusive monopoly representation to force everyone into the collective, and then they add the injustice. They force people to pay for giving up their own right to represent themselves. You know, workers in America sometimes believe that they may be able to get different benefits, or certain things benefit them differently than other workers. And the fact is, under exclusive monopoly bargaining, which is the primary mechanism of labor policy in America, workers, their voices are basically mitigated on behalf of the voices of the whole. Now, some people would say that's a great thing. I would say not necessarily, and we need to protect individual freedom. You know, the First Amendment of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, was all about certain rights that individuals had, and I believe the right to represent yourself, the right to speak for yourself, is something that should never be subjected to an election.
But if I don't pay the fees, I'm still getting representation from a union.
But that's not your fault. That's the union's fault. The union wants exclusive monopoly representation. And, you know, United Auto Workers Union down in Tennessee is now talking about a model that's been legal ever since labor law was promulgated in the United States. They're going to do member-only bargaining. They're going to bargain for those people that want to be members, and if they get benefits for those folks, Pedro, then I think workers will join them if they're providing good services. Now, as the exclusive monopoly bargaining agent, the only voice in the workplace that basically takes away an individual's right to negotiate and to talk to an employer, or an employer to reward good behavior, good work, to punish bad work, those things kind of set aside under this monopoly bargaining agreement that union officials use, and they use it as the context for saying, well, we've got to represent these workers. Not true. They don't have to. But then they say if we've got to represent these workers, then they have to pay a fee.
How many states have these type of laws?
24 now, Pedro. I think the last time we met it was 22, so it's 24 now.
Who got added on?
Indiana and Michigan added right-to-work laws in 2012. Michigan's went into effect in 2013.
And are there other states considering it as well?
There are a lot, actually. Kentucky's considering it, Missouri's considering it, Montana's considering it. Lots of other states are looking at it. There have been right-to-work bills introduced in several state legislatures around the country.
What drives a state to incorporate these type of laws, do you think?
Well, I think first and foremost, the individuals feel about the individual freedom that a right-to-work law brings. But now, as we look at the economic situation of many states, if you look where manufacturing job growth is increasing, where private sector job growth is increasing, where companies are citing new facilities, right-to-work states are demonstrably better at attracting jobs in the private sector, certainly since 2008, but even before that. It's an economic decision. You know, site selection experts that work with companies that want to locate or expand facilities, they say that 50, sometimes almost 75% of the people looking to expand or relocate will only consider right-to-work states as a potential siting selection for their new investment.
Mark Mix talking about right-to-work issues and laws in the United States. If you want to ask him questions about it.
Pedro, Karen's talking about what is at-will employment laws in several states. They're definitely distinct from right-to-work laws. The at-will employment doctrine is, as Karen describes, this notion that an employer can step in and say, you know, I have cause to believe that we need to fire you. That's the at-will employment doctrine. There are states that don't have right-to-work laws that have at-will employment doctrines. But the bottom line is right to work is simply about a worker's right to choose whether or not they want to financially support a labor union. The at-will employment doctrine is a different doctrine, different law, different part of the law, and has really nothing to do with Florida's right to work law. If in Florida you wanted to form a union, your right to form that union is protected, Karen, and the employer is regulated, and there are certain laws about what they can do and what they can't do, what they can say, what they can't say, and so those rules are promulgated in the private sector by the National Labor Relations Board here in Washington, D.C., and enforced by the NLRB, and employees have direct access to the NLRB process. I mean, it may be a difficult one to navigate, but it's there for them, and there are certain laws that set out what employers and what employees can do vis-a-vis unionization.
Yeah. Joe.
It sounds like a very, very happy voluntary union member, and good for you. And that's exactly what unions ought to be doing, and you're happy with the service they're providing with you. Nothing stopped you from joining them. You can pay them their dues. You can pay them more if you want. You can support all the things they do because you do that voluntarily, and they provide a great service for you. As it relates to the ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, we're not a member of the American Legislative Exchange Council. We used to be in the past, but American Legislative Exchange Council is a group that puts together state legislators from across the country. I think at one time, they were the largest state legislative group in the country. They had something like 3,000 state legislators that would attend, and they provide ideas about model legislation. Right to work is one of the model legislations that ALEC has produced in the past. We've also attended the National Council of State Legislators meetings where legislators come together and get ideas about legislation, talk about issues in the marketplace. And at ALEC, there are corporate sponsors, just like there are at the National Council of State Legislatures as well. There are corporate sponsors for that too, and they participate in that process. Yeah, Aiden, that's right. And under this exclusive bargaining privilege, it actually, an employer can be charged with an unfair labor practice if they negotiate or talk to an individual employee when a contract is enforced there. They can't adjudicate a problem. For example, if you had an issue with your pay stub or something, and the employer said, well, Aiden, you've been doing great work, and we want to increase your salary by $1 an hour, the union officials could come in and say, no, that's a violation of the contract. They would file an unfair labor practice against this negotiation between you and the employer and get that $1 raise taken away because of the exclusive monopoly bargaining power they have in the workplace. And that's really the injustice for the individual employee, is that they take away this right. In fact, in a U.S. Supreme Court argument we just had back on June 30th, we argued a case on January 21st called Harris v. Quinn. Sam Alito asked a series of questions of a union lawyer by the name of Paul Smith about this idea that in a contract negotiation there could be issues where someone who's 24 years old would benefit dramatically by a pocket of money that could go for a cash basically raise versus an increase in a pension, and someone who's 64 years old obviously is more interested in the pension. And Sam Alito asked this union lawyer, do you call that person that disagrees with what the union's doing for them, what do you call that person? Do you call that person seeing some kind of a free rider or something? And Paul Smith said, yeah, they would be. But here he admitted openly in Supreme Court arguments that these workers could be negatively benefited, but yet they're forced to accept this representation. And then in the states that don't have right to work laws, they're forced to pay for that injustice.
The columnist for Forbes, Rick Unger, wrote about right to work laws, and this is part of what he said. He said the inevitable result of gaining fewer members and less money through dues and agency fees to support union collective bargaining activities is the strengthening of the employer's hand in collective bargaining negotiations. A trend that obviously bodes well for business profitability, if less encouraging for workers who are less likely to suffer lower wages as a result.
Yeah, and Peter, that's kind of an interesting quote, and I don't know exactly the context. I think I did read that article. But the bottom line is this: that nothing in a right-to-work state stops workers from trying to join unions. I mean, in Tennessee, at the Volkswagen plant, I know previously you talked a little bit about that Volkswagen situation. We ended up representing the employees at Volkswagen. We were their lawyers filing unfair labor practice charges, not only against the United Auto Workers, but Volkswagen in a very, very interesting situation down there. But nothing in a right-to-work state stops anyone from organizing or wanting to join a union. And that's really the issue that union officials, they want you to believe that somehow unions can't exist in right-to-work states. But we do know, Pedro, that in several right-to-work states, in Alabama and Iowa, they have higher union densities in states that don't have right-to-work laws. So I don't know how to explain it other than that union officials realize that they're in the marketplace. And if they're going to get services and get people to join them and pay them revenue, they've got to provide good services to workers. If they do that, workers will come. Yeah, Michael, in Tennessee, the context we were talking about, Tennessee, was the Volkswagen unionization drive at the new facility in Chattanooga. Actually, the employer was on the side of the union in that particular case. They were trying desperately to get the UAW into the workplace. In fact, we had to file an unfair labor practice charge against the United Auto Workers and Volkswagen because of some of the actions they took to force the union inside. It turns out in that particular situation in Tennessee, What the union wanted was a card check union certification, and that is where you have no secret ballot election, where workers can't go behind a curtain or take a ballot and privately vote yes or no for a union. In Tennessee, what the UAW wanted was a card check certification, which says basically, if I can get you to sign a card, then that card counts as a vote, and that vote is in favor of the union. And once the union gets a majority of those cards signed, the employer accepts them, and the union represents every single worker in the bargaining unit, except even those workers that didn't sign a card or didn't want to sign a card. So what happened in Tennessee was the employer and the union got together. The employees said, no, we're not interested, and they fought back. And of course, the UAW claimed they had a majority of the cards, but no one ever saw these cards. We filed some unfair labor practice charges about how these cards were obtained. They were giving away tickets to an amusement park and other things to get these cards signed. And once they had a secret ballot election, the workers in Chattanooga voted against the UAW. And so now we're in the process of looking at a situation where the United Auto Workers has set up a new local union, Local 42 in Chattanooga. And this is going to be a member-only union. It's very exciting to see what they're doing here, because they realize that if they sell a product to workers and workers want to join them voluntarily, they're not charging anyone dues at this point, and they can't force anyone to pay dues in the right to work state of Tennessee. But they're going to create membership. They're going to go back to VW and say, hey, we've got a majority that are voluntary members of our union. Can you recognize us? We'll see what the workers want to do down there, and we're a long ways off, actually, as to what's going to happen in Tennessee. But to your point, in Tennessee, it was the employer and the union officials that were trying to get the workers to join a union. When they voted in a secret ballot, they voted against union representation.
Can union members opt out of paying dues for political activity?
Yeah, Pedro, they can. It's not easy, but they can. And it's a difficult decision for them, because the cases, there are two cases, then the Right to Work Foundation litigated both of them. One is called the Beck decision, Beck versus Communication Workers of America. It was a Supreme Court case. It was decided in 1988. And what the Supreme Court said in that case, we found out there was a telephone lineman, Harry Beck, who now lives out in Oregon. He was from La Plata, Maryland. And he found out that the union was spending his money, his compulsory dues, on political causes which he disagreed with and candidates. So we filed a lawsuit, and this lawsuit went all the way from the very beginning of the NLRB process all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in the process, we found out through the union's own accounting that they were only spending about 19% of all the union dues on things that directly reflected collective bargaining and contract negotiation and grievance arbitration, those three things. So the court said, well, we got to let the union charge for those fees, but we can't let them force workers to pay for these political things. But unfortunately for Harry Beck, what he had to do, Pedro, was he had to decide between his workplace rights and his political rights. Because in order for Harry Beck to vote on the contract that governs his employment, in order to vote on the union leadership that makes decisions about how his contract is negotiated and the conditions of employment, in order to participate in any union activity or intra-company activity, he had to be a member of the union. But if he was a member of the union, then any money that he spent for union dues could be used for political causes which he disagreed. So what did he have to do? He had to resign union membership and get a reduced payment of fees, but here he had to give up his workplace rights to vote on a contract, to vote in union elections, and to participate in union elections. It's a Hobson's choice that a worker shouldn't have to be forced with. I mean, what's more important? Your conscience, your opposition to issues, or being involved and an active part of the workplace. Workers shouldn't be forced to make that decision, but it's the monopoly bargaining power of organized labor that forced Harry Beck into that decision. We have a similar case in the public sector, a line of cases called Abood and Hudson and Abood in the private sector, or in the, government sector. Same type of rights, but again, the same issue of having to give up one set of rights to protect another. Yeah, what happens in the bargaining process, I have not negotiated a contract back and forth. Obviously, we've represented literally hundreds of thousands of employees. Some have been former union officers and told stories like that. But, certainly if there's a place for workers joining together voluntarily to increase the volume of their voice. No question about that. There always has been a place. There will be a place for the workers joining together voluntarily. What we would say at the Right to Work organization is there's no place for compulsion in that process. If you have to force workers to pay fees or dues in order to get or keep a job in America, you've really gone beyond what you could be doing if you were actually convincing these workers to join you voluntarily. We know that any organization that is brought together through voluntary means is inherently stronger than one that's forced together through compulsion. Samuel Gompers knew this. He knew that voluntarism was the key for strong union movements. And since 1935, unfortunately, here in Washington, labor union officials came and they lobbied Congress for labor policies now that dictate labor policy across the country. And one of the primary components of that policy is the ability to compel people into the unions. Instead of going out and recruiting workers, providing services to them, they use government power to force them in, and that really causes, I think, unrest inside of the union movement. It's a problem for them. Yeah, you know, that's a difficult situation. Don't know exactly the details of it, but you do see that conflict between union leadership and rank and file workers. We saw it at Boeing with the machinist union contract up there. The International Machinist Union here in Washington had one view on the contract. The local union out there, the rank and file workers at Boeing, had another view on the contract. And it was this kind of conflict inside the union that caused trouble. You know, I think it's United Food and Commercial Worker Local 400 here that is a very, very strong union. They do a good job for their members. In Virginia, obviously, the members of that local union have the right to choose whether or not to financially support that union. We think that makes them more accountable. Certainly in Maryland, unfortunately, they don't. You can be compelled to pay dues or fees or lose your job in that state because it does not have a right to work law.
According to the AFL-CIO, they say that states with right to work laws have, and they list a couple of things, the average worker in those states with those laws makes about $1,500 a year less. The median household income in states with these laws is about $6,400 less than other states. They also say that in states with right to work laws, 26% of jobs are low wage occupations, compared with 19% in other states.
Wow, yeah. You know, the AFL-CIO puts out that study, Pedro, and it's interesting because David Madeline and I were on a radio show the other day and we had a discussion over that very issue. Basically what happens with the AFL-CIO is they do not adjust for cost of living. When you adjust for cost of living, you find out that workers in right-to-work states have about $2,300 more in purchasing power, disposable income than states in forced unionism states. And we know this because the American Federation of Teachers, which is an AFL-CIO affiliate, did the study for us. They took all the teacher salaries across the country and they took cost of living adjusted wages, and they tried to prove that the teachers in California were making less than teachers in some other state because they wanted to get a pay raise in California. Well, we took their exact methodology, their cost of living index, and we overlaid it on private sector wages in right-to-work states versus non-right-to-work states, and we found that workers in right-to-work states had higher disposable income and more purchasing power with their money. It makes sense to compare apples to apples. If you're going to take a plumber in Manhattan and a plumber in Utah and you're going to compare their wages, surely the plumber in Manhattan makes more money. But how far does that money go? And does cost of living make a difference? Well, surely it does. In fact, David and his group, American Center for American Progress, did a study, and they found that right-to-work states had higher disposable income. But what they said then was that people with an AGI of over 200,000, when you take them out, then it's worse. But the fact is, when you look at the IRS data on that, the states that have forced union states have a higher percentage of workers making over 200,000, and so if you take it out, the difference gets even better for workers in right-to-work states.
You're hearing Mark Mix from the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation.
Yeah. I was in a small town in Texas, John, just real quick. I was in a small town in Texas about a month ago, and there was still a soda fountain down there. So there still may be opportunities for that skill you had. But yeah, you know, there is something about that, about increased productivity, increased technology. There are things that become, quote, labor-saving devices, Pedro, that people implement to make life easier and to make jobs easier. And that's one of the things we have to deal with. I think we would, well, I won't speak for everyone, but I think from my standpoint, I mean, Pedro, you're sitting here with a little iPad Surface computer and a camera overhead and lights and a technologically advanced studio. I mean, I would think these are good things for us. It helps you get the word out better in a more effective and a more efficient way.
Just fast, the caller mentioned McDonald's. I wanted to get your thoughts on this National Labor Relations Board decision on McDonald's. Yeah,
Pedro, that's a big deal. Joint liability there. This is the relationship between a franchisor and a franchisee. And what this decision by the Solicitor General, the General Counsel, Richard Griffin of the National Labor Relations Board, he made this ruling saying that the franchisor can be held jointly liable for acts of the franchisee. Now, certainly in a franchise arrangement, this is something that is well established in American business. I mean, I don't know how many businesses we go into on a daily basis that may be franchisees of a big franchisor. And what that says is that this joint liability is going to allow union officials now to file unfair labor practice charges against the mothership company, in this case McDonald's in Oak Brook, Illinois, when perhaps an owner of a small McDonald's franchise in Paducah, Kentucky does something wrong. I'm not sure that's the best model, and probably what's going to end up happening is that we end up getting all stores become corporate stores, and if they continue with this, then why would you sell your rights to a franchisee unless you can dictate everything they do, from wages all the way up the line. Now, I know that they allow them to use their packaging and their uniforms, and there's a style of how you do business at a McDonald's or a Wendy's or a Burger King. I mean, that's one thing that a franchisee agrees to, but the notion that somehow the franchisor can be held liable is a dramatic shift in labor policy, and it shows that this administration is interested in trying to find a way to help organized labor find a new group of workers to unionize. Yeah, well, if it happens again, give us a call, 800-336-3600. We have 18 lawyers that will work to help you exercise your rights under the law. They won't help you force anyone else to join a union, but they'll help you vindicate your rights in order to join a union. We've actually represented workers who've been fired for trying to form unions at the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. As far as your opening statement, I've been called a lot of things. I've had my tires slashed. I've had mail sent to my home that my kids pick up with my head cut off and blood dripping down. And I've been called a lot of things, but I've never been called that. And so I'm offended that you would make that comparison. And that shows that how weak your argument is, sir, if you're going to resort to that type of behavior. Here's what right to work law does, right to work laws do, and you need to understand it. Look at a right to work law. They simply provide the opportunity for workers to choose whether or not to be part of a union and pay a fee as a condition of working. That's all they do. The argument you have is that union officials have a primary conflict with the workers they claim to represent, because right to work is about workers having the choice. It has nothing to do with anybody else except for the parties, and Wisconsin's a great example of that. When government employees in Wisconsin were given right to work protections under Act 10, I think in some bargaining units, 80% of the workers voluntarily chose no longer to support the union. That's quite an indictment on union leadership, and I would say you talk to those people about the problem they have with forced unionism.
Donald is next from Louisiana, Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I just wanted to make a comment about what Mr. Nick said about the voluntarism. I mean, it doesn't make sense for you to be part of an organization and not support it. I mean, the organization is not going to last, without support. So it doesn't make sense for you to say you shouldn't be forced to pay dues. Well, I mean, why would you join an organization if you're not going to support the organization? It's silly. That's all I wanted to say. Appreciate it.
What we're saying is those workers don't want to join the union. For example, a worker that voted no against union representation, how is it that he basically assents to being forced to pay a fee to a union he did not want to be part of? That's the question. If you want to be part of a labor union, you absolutely can pay dues. In fact, you don't even have to work in a union environment to pay dues to a union. They have associate programs, the steelworkers, the AFL-CIO, where they ask you to join the union just as an ordinary citizen, like you would join the Chamber of Commerce or like you would join the Lions Club or the Rotary. And of course, those people that join those groups voluntarily support those groups financially. They absolutely do. And that's the same standard that ought to be applied to labor unions. John, if you could take on just for a second, because
let him go.
I'm sorry, yes. Pedro. I wanted to ask one question, because his point about an employer talking to employees in the context outside of the contract would be an unfair labor practice, John. You know that. I mean, as an HR guy, there are certain things you can do and can't do for employees in a unionized environment. But John's point is really spot on. The fact is, if an employer is treating workers that way, they deserve unionization, and there is a process for workers to organize and to unionize in a situation like that, Pedro. No question about it. I mean, even Richard Trump of the AFL-CIO would admit that workers who want to join a union can file a petition, they can have an election with the National Labor Relations Board, and if they win that election, they can be in a union, and a union can represent them. I mean, I know that that's an oversimplification of how that process works, but the bottom line, no one is is prohibited from joining a union or organizing a union in the country. That's the fact. Yeah, and Texas is a right-to-work state, so good for him, good for you, and that's the way it should work. And in Texas, he had the right to join voluntarily but could not be compelled. He chose to join, and it benefited you, so congratulations.
Mark Mix is with the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, joining us to talk about right-to-work states and right-to-work laws. Thanks for your time this morning.
Pedro, my pleasure. Thank you.